everybody. Welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. I'm your host, Beth Pilgreen, and today we're going to be talking about corporate culture and how to introduce change into that culture. It's not an easy task considering the less than enthusiastic way people tend to react to change, not to mention the fact that many people aren't really entirely sure what culture refers to. However, by the end of this episode, you will. Because today we are joined by Sibohan McHale. She is the Executive General Manager of People, Culture, and Change at Dulux Group in Melbourne, Australia. And she is also the author of an upcoming book titled The Insider's Guide to Culture Change, Creating a Workplace that Delivers, Grows, and Adapts. Welcome to Project HR, Sibohan.
Thank you so much, Beth. And it's great to be chatting with you today.
It's so nice to chat with you too. We're really glad to have you here.
Yeah, I'm excited about it.
Wonderful. I would love to kick things off by getting to know you a little bit better. You've been called a culture transformation expert. Have you always been interested in the concepts of culture and change?
Yes, I have. I studied psychology at university, and while my fellow classmates were going off to study clinical psychology and have careers in that pathway, I was much more interested in organizational psychology. So I went down that pathway of how people can be at their best and highest in the workplace. One of my first jobs as a student at university, I was actually working in a warehouse in London as a summer job. And what I noticed in that job was the power of workplace culture. And actually, I was picking vinyl records and packing them off to stores in the days before digital music. And at morning tea one day, one of my colleagues came up and said, "Can you slow down? Because if you go too fast in picking the vinyl records, then my boss will expect us all to work that quickly."
Wow.
So eventually it was really bizarre. And I was thinking, this is really strange. But essentially the culture was a go slow culture. And within a couple of days, the supervisor actually said, "Oh, we don't have enough work for you here," which seemed amazing to me because the warehouse was so bustling. But essentially, I walked into a culture that was a go slow culture, and I was a hare. I was a fast worker. So that was one of my early lessons on culture.
That's so interesting that they would rather keep their culture than amp things up and teach people to do things in faster processes.
Yeah, well, that is often the power of culture, that you, as an individual, you walk into an organizational culture, and within days it captures you. And often you start to morph your behavior into those ways of operating. And it's often invisible to you after a while. Within 3 months, I say the culture becomes invisible to you almost. So you don't even realize that you're in this that warehouse. It was a go slow culture. And I had come in and I had resisted that, but the culture had spat me out because of that. It couldn't have this person who was going against the norms and the patterns in the organization.
Well, you've been in charge of change at a number of large organizations, and I understand that your change initiatives at ANZ Bank completely transformed the company. Can you tell us what happened there?
Sure. So I joined the ANZ Bank in the early 2000s when John McFarland had been appointed as the CEO. And when he walked into the organisation, he actually walked into a storm because at that time, bank bashing had become a national sport and everybody was complaining about how bad the banks were, including the media and the journalists and the radio hosts and the general public. And I joined the culture team there, and 3 years later, I became head of the whole transformation across the bank. And over the course of 7 years, we undertook a radical transformation where the bank went from the worst performing bank in the country to the number one bank globally on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So customer satisfaction went from the lowest levels of all the big banks to the highest level in the country. We created one of the most efficient banks in the world with a cost-to-income ratio of 45%. the share price almost tripled, the profits doubled, and the employee engagement also increased significantly. So
My goodness.
that was a 7-year change process that I talk about in the book, but it was very radical and very significant.
Yeah, I'll say. Do you think that this experience and others like it led to the creation of the concepts that you detailed in your book?
Yes, it did. And one of the things that I noticed, I spent the first decade of my career as a management consultant. So essentially, I spent 10 years flying in and out of organizations across Europe and America and Australia, essentially advising leaders about how to change culture and researching best practice ideas about culture. But something was missing for me. So I spent the last 2 decades actually within organizations as the executive in charge of culture change. And I noticed that in this insider role, as the person responsible for change, I had a different perspective. And when I looked at most of the books on the shelves that were written about culture, most of them had been written with that outsider perspective, either by academics or journalists or management consultants. And of course, I've been there myself. This is an incredibly valuable outsider perspective. But I felt we also needed an insider perspective from somebody who had been in charge of change, who had tested the theories, who had sort of determined which ones really work, because theories are fine, but sometimes when you put them into practice, you discover actually that one's better than this one, or this one helps change and move a bit faster. So that was the perspective I wanted to bring, rather than just sort of say, well, where is that perspective? I wanted to create it.
Sure. Well, and I can see that it would give so much more value too. You're not just giving people bullet points from the outside. You've actually done it. Like you said, you've tested these and you've had to even do some detours at times because what you thought would work didn't work. And so I'm excited for this book to come out because I think that a lot of people are going to want to get their hands on it. As we mentioned at the top of the show, though, in order to affect change in culture, first you have to understand what you mean when you say culture, right? And you've got quite the signature definition of the term yourself. So I'd love to start there. How do you define culture?
Culture is one of the most talked about but least understood concepts in workplaces today. And I think people tend to define it in their own unique ways, and they generally talk about it being values and behaviors. However, you can publish your values and the culture can still remain exactly as it was, and in the dysfunctional ways, operating in dysfunctional ways that it has been. So my definition of culture is that it's the patterns of relating or the often hidden agreements that determine how the organization operates or functions. So these patterns of relating are really often hidden, but they are the underlying agreements that determine what goes on in the organization.
Can you give us some examples of these patterns that you're referring to?
Absolutely. So I worked with a person, let's call him Jonathan, at an organization, let's call it AAA Consulting. So Jonathan and I worked together in the past, and he called me up to ask for my advice about culture because he had lost a lot of consulting bids in the past 6 months, and he knew that something was wrong. So we caught up, and he talked about the fact that clients in the past had asked for his help when they wanted to do big restructurings or big IT projects. And he was like this safe pair of hands. But the environment has shifted, and clients were now demanding much more agile and innovative solutions. And he lost the last 3 bids in a row. So he was saying, I need to create a more innovative culture. And I said, well, what have you done? He said, I've produced a new values booklet. And he showed me the booklet, and it was very glossy and had all the right words about innovation and imagination and thinking outside the box. And he'd also redesigned his office to an open plan area. So, trying to create more idea sharing. And he'd even sent his consultants on an innovation training course, but he still kept losing bids to more nimble and agile competitors. So we had a long conversation, and during that conversation, I said to Jonathan, can you talk to me about what happened with your last losing bid? And so he described what happened. And then I said, did you, deliver the same tired old thinking? And the client wasn't happy with it and he didn't get the job. So I said, did you sign off on the losing bid? And he said, yes, my role as managing partner, we ran out of time and I signed off on it. And I said, well, therein lies the pattern, because your consultants are in role of traditional thinkers, but by signing off on the losing bids that they're producing, you are the approver of that pattern or of that lack of innovation.
Oh.
You are an enabler to that pattern. So essentially, there was an agreement or a pattern of relating between Jonathan as the managing partner and his consulting team that it's okay to deliver the same tired old thinking around here. So even though the published values said we value innovation, the pattern of relating was that we value traditional thinking around here.
Right.
And in fact, when you looked at the behavior of the other partners in the firm, they hired for traditional thinkers, they promoted traditional thinkers, and they tended to reward those people as well. So, on the one hand, they were explicitly saying we value innovation, but the underlying pattern was indicating something else. And this agreement that Jonathan was co-creating and fueling was that we really value the old tired old thinking around here.
Wow. So that's so interesting. So he finally was able to see the light when you pinpointed it. I see that he was trying to make efforts with his new values booklet that was shiny and new with innovation in his new office for ideas. But yeah, absolutely. If you don't change your behavior, then you're going to be stuck in the same cycle.
Correct. So he didn't see the underlying patterns. He was doing all the stuff that leaders are told to do. Roll out your new values, focus on the behaviors, but he wasn't seeing the co-created pattern or agreement between his team and himself. He was inadvertently fueling. And that was the pattern that was running the organization. And once I drew the pattern for him, then he could see it. And the key to change was to step into a different role. So he stepped out of the role of approver of traditional thinking and into role of innovation leader to help his team to transition into the future state.
That's awesome. Okay, well, as we understand culture better, we can address change, right? So what kind of changes are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it does connect with one of the big myths about culture, because often when we talk about culture, people automatically say, how's the culture going? People will often automatically go to the employee experience. So they will think about how do employees feel? Are they engaged? What's the trust like? Do people feel included? Do they have psychological safety? But actually, this type of change can be about any aspect of how your business is operating, from how you're designing your solutions, manufacturing your products, to selling and distributing your products. Culture impacts every aspect of how your business operates, not just the employee experience, if that makes sense. So you can decide to create a culture, for example, that's commercial, that's strategic, that's disciplined, that's risk averse or safety conscious, growth oriented, agile, performance focused, customer driven, and so on. The list is, and so on and so on. So, we've got to start reframing culture from being this soft, it's all about the employees and how they feel, to actually, it's that, of course, but it's also about the other list of things that I talked about. And I think that's the challenge, particularly for HR professionals today, is that increasingly I see leaders asking for solutions to those problems. So they're not necessarily always asking for how do I increase engagement. They're saying to HR professionals, I need a culture that's more agile, or more commercial, or more performance driven. Can you help me with that problem? And we can't be walking up to them just with the engagement survey. That is not enough. We've got to have the toolkit to help those leaders to create those workplaces that they need in this volatile, uncertain environment that we are currently in, with change happening at very rapid pace.
Right. What are some of the typical pitfalls that you see that leaders encounter when they're trying to affect these kinds of changes in their culture?
Some of the pitfalls relate to the fact that leaders are comfortable in certain areas and less comfortable in others. So
Hmm.
leaders do tend to focus on behavior change and trying to affect that behavior change, sometimes through things like working with people's personalities, for example. So, they might use personality testing or they might define people's personalities in terms of certain indicators. But often you can bring about change more quickly if you focus on role rather than trying to change somebody's personality, because that's quite fixed, whereas role is more malleable. So
Sure.
you can, for example, let's say there's Sarah Connors, who's head of a department in a New York hospital, and she takes up multiple roles throughout her day. So Sarah, she wakes up in the morning and greets her husband, Mark, good morning, in role of wife. Then she goes down the hallway and helps her twins to get ready for school in role of mother, and her behavior changes. She goes into work, she deals with some first year medical students, and she steps into role of teacher. Later that day, she meets her boss at lunch to talk about the need for new imaging equipment in her department, and she steps into role of negotiator. And in the afternoon, a colleague sweeps in for a second opinion, and she steps into role of advisor. Now, in each of those roles, Sarah's behavior changes automatically. And she doesn't need a training course. She doesn't need to change her personality. She's still Sarah Connors, but her behavior changes according to her role. That ability to really frame and reframe people's roles according to the requirements of the change and where the organization is heading, rather than trying to change people's personalities.
Well, I'd love to switch gears and talk a little bit about your book. Clearly, your book is a much needed resource in trying to navigate all of this. The Insider's Guide to Culture Change centers on your approach to culture transformation. Are you able to share some of the critical steps in the process with us?
Sure. I think one of the critical steps in any culture change is to diagnose what's really going on in the organization before moving to solutions. And this step is often overlooked by leaders because they're often under enormous pressure to move very quickly to solutions. So in that pressure to move to solutions, they tend to rush the diagnosis and therefore miss some of the underlying patterns that are really running the organization. One of the stories I can tell you about was a water contract. Let's say it was a company called Waterworks, and there was a maintenance team looking after a 10-year contract for that organization. So essentially, it was their role to fix all the water pipes and to maintain the treatment plants. So they were that maintenance team. And the manager of the maintenance team, let's call her Chloe, she called me in for some advice because the team wasn't performing and the government client was really worried about their performance. They weren't fixing the leakages fast enough and the treatment plants weren't operating optimally. And when I spoke to Chloe, she said, I need a leadership training program for my supervisors because the supervisors just aren't stepping up and they're not taking their people along with them and they're not training them in how to do things properly. So she was really under a lot of pressure to get things happening more efficiently and effectively at Waterworks. So rather than go with that, I said, sure, I can definitely design you a supervisory training program. But after I'd asked her a few questions, I began to think that it was more of a culture problem than a training problem. So I said, would you mind if we press the pause button on the training program and I'll do a short, sharp diagnosis of the culture just to confirm that we're on the right track. So despite the pressure she was under, she said, okay, I'll give you 3 weeks, that's it, but I really have to get on with this because my boss is breathing down my neck. We took the time out, we did a 3-week diagnostic, and the findings were very, very revealing because what I discovered was, yes, all the management team, that when we interviewed them, they pointed the finger at the supervisors and said, yes, supervisors are the problem. They haven't stepped up. They're not able to lead. But when I interviewed the supervisors and the employees, I got a very different story. So what we discovered there was that the supervisors and the employees told the story about the management team, the new management team who had come in and had thrown away policy and procedure documents that they had spent years developing and which they had used to run waterworks. So they'd thrown those policies away and put in new policies because the client had asked them to do that. They had, with the new management team, new policies and procedures. But what that signaled to the supervisors was they don't respect us.
Oh,
So this pattern of disrespect was going round and round. So the supervisors dug their heels in and said, well, why should we help them with these new policies? They threw away our policies. They don't respect us. So
wow.
and they started casting aspersions on the management team and pointing the finger at them, saying they don't know what they're doing. The management team were doing the same to them, saying they don't respect us. And this pattern of disrespect that you don't know and you don't care was going around and around. This pattern between the managers and the supervisors was actually running the organization. So what would have happened, do you think, if we had gone ahead and designed a supervisor's training program and made the supervisors go on this leadership training program?
Yeah.
It would have actually fueled the pattern of you don't know what you're doing, the pattern of you don't know, and the pattern of disrespect. Supervisors may have seen that as another example of management not appreciating their skills and their experience and their know-how. So one of the big traps is that sometimes we can put in solutions that actually become our problems and that accelerate the negativity in the culture.
How do you fight, like, let's say you do put a new pattern in with the culture to promote positive change. What's it like with the employees that are used to doing things a certain way for years and years? Is it hard changing mindsets?
It is hard changing mindsets, but it is faster changing mindsets if you can change role.
Okay.
So if you, and this is how patterns are connected to roles. So let's say in the last example of waterworks, the supervisors and the management team were in role of fighting with each other. So they had taken up the role of fighters, blaming each other. You've got to reframe the role. They're not fighting with each other, they're collaborators. So reframing the role from stop blaming, you're in this negative pattern. As soon as they saw the pattern, they went, oh, that's right. That is what we're stuck in at the moment. We're both pointing the finger and blaming each other for how we're not performing at waterworks. Imagine if we could take up a different role. Imagine if we could collaborate together, leave the past behind, draw a line in the sand, take up a role of collaborators to deliver the best service that we possibly can to our customers.
Yeah.
So reframing role can actually bring about change faster. You can just decide, they decided in a workshop, right, we're going to collaborate. We're going to give it up. We're going to stop the fight. We're going to collaborate. And change started to happen much more rapidly because of that role reframe and changing the mental map of their role and their relatedness between them. So despite the fact that we often think our culture change can take years and years, the reframing can make change happen a lot faster.
Yeah. It sounded like when they had the light shone on their behavior towards each other, that was the pivot. That was the catalyst to walk towards quicker change. They just didn't know. Is that right?
Absolutely. That's absolutely the case. Often when you see the pattern, it's like,
Yeah.
I see it now. It was like Jonathan in the consulting firm. As soon as he saw that he was the approver of the losing bids, he went, it's so clear to me now. I have to become the innovation leader.
Wow.
Oh, that's really clear. He literally, within 3 months, he had won a major multi-million-dollar bid. He was back on track.
Wow.
Yes, it's that fast. It didn't take him 3 years. He then started to say, right, I'm going to demand more innovative thinking in this next proposal. I'm not going to sign off on it until I see really innovative ways And that started to shift the pattern almost immediately.
That is so cool. Well, let me ask you this. Once a culture has been successfully transformed and the change has been embraced by the employees and leadership alike, is the effort complete at that point? Is the culture now set in stone, or is there any post-transformation follow-up, for example?
The answer to that question is that culture is never set in stone because change happens constantly. It could be changes within the organization or it could be changes outside the organization, but your culture constantly needs to adjust to those changes. So it could be that the competitive landscape changes. It could be that a new CEO comes along. It could be that your shareholders are demanding more growth. It could be that your customers want a different offering. All of those changes mean that the culture has to constantly stay agile and you've got to constantly be tweaking it. So it's always evolving. It's always changing and it needs to be fluid. That would be my answer to that. You've got to constantly be diagnosing what's going on in the culture. And is it meeting the imperatives of the organization? Because culture is essentially an enabler of your business goals and your strategy. It's not something that sits in isolation to that, if that makes sense.
Sure. No, it definitely does. And that brings me to my next question. Do you think that there's a point where a culture can change too often or become too fluid?
I have seen cultures when new CEOs come in and they lurch from one culture to the next, and that's not always constructive. But generally, I haven't seen that many cultures that are too fluid because culture, these patterns tend to be deeply embedded. So as we mentioned earlier, they are changing the mental maps of all the employees within the organization, and that doesn't happen that easily. It does take some time. So you need alignment around culture, though. You can't have everybody just going off with their own view of what the culture is. You need leadership of culture. Culture change is leader-led, is one of my mantras, and leaders cannot abrogate their responsibility to lead the culture change, and they cannot delegate that culture change to HR, the HR department, to fix. It must be leader-led, and HR enables that change by taking up their role with expert advice, tools, and support.
Yeah. From the top down. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
That makes sense. In your view, what would you say are the ultimate benefits of a company creating this more adaptable culture?
One of the things that I believe organizations are not tapping into fully is that culture is your ultimate source of competitive advantage. So people can replicate your products, they can copy your services, but they can never fully replicate your culture that is unique to you. Culture can be your ultimate source of competitive advantage if you leverage it. It's as unique as a thumbprint. You cannot copy your culture. Everything else can be copied. So I think leaders today have this opportunity to create a culture that is unique and that is a source of advantage in their organizations.
Well, Siobhan, I've truly enjoyed talking culture change with you today, and it's given me hope that companies can be successful in making positive changes to their culture. At the time of this recording, Siobhan's book, The Insider's Guide to Culture Change, Creating a Workplace That Delivers, Grows, and Adapts, is available for pre-order on Amazon and will be released in February of 2020. So be sure and reserve your copy today. And now, Siobhan, it's time for our lightning round questions. These are the questions we ask every guest of the podcast. And beware, the first question may be a little silly. So are you ready to give this a shot?
Sure, go for it.
Okay. Topic showdown. Today, we've been talking about change. In your opinion, which is harder, Siobhan? To change your mind or change a tire?
Definitely to change your mind.
I wish I knew how to change a tire. What's the worst job interview question you've ever been asked?
Wow, I once got a job offer from two executives in the same organization, and they asked me to work in their teams, and that was really tricky and bizarre because I had to choose between them, which was really stressful.
Yes, that's awkward too.
Yeah, very awkward.
What's your favorite thing about working in HR?
I'm passionate about making workplaces better, and I just love the opportunity that working in HR allows me to do that.
I think you're really good at it too, Sibohan.
Thank you.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
When I was a consultant at Accenture, I had a partner who said, attend all meetings. And actually what he was really saying was keep your ear to the ground and understand what's going on in the ecosystem. And I really connect with that even today. So keep a finger on the pulse of what's happening, and attend all meetings was part of that.
I like that. Who or what inspires you?
I find leaders who take on the challenge of culture change to create better workplaces. I find those leaders really inspiring.
I do too. Well, Sibohan, thank you so much for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
And thanks also to our listeners. Don't forget to grab the companion for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. In it, you'll find notes, links, resources, and more. Also, if you'd like to be on Project HR or know someone who would, feel free to chat with us live at projectionsinc.com/podcast or email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. Thanks to all our new subscribers and to everyone who's been listening. We love getting your feedback. Don't forget to rate us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your content. That's it from me for now. So let's make this a great day at work.